So we've reached the midpoint of this great epic. It's not bad for 10 years in the works. I thought I'd take a moment here to have a little excursus on this text, to talk a little bit about it, just candidly, off the cuff. No notes, just candidly. I've taught this work for many, many years. And of course, before me, it's been read by many generations, and recited by many generations, and translated, and sometimes even performed on stage. Why did I decide to do this reading, though, in the first place? Well, partly because of the history of the work. You know, this is one of the great works of Western culture. It is the foundation for much of what we now have as our Western culture, our literature, our politics, the way we think about ourselves, even our military operations, owes a great deal to this text. So what's the history of the text? If you don't know already, it's written, allegedly, legend has it, by a fellow by the name of Homer, which means the captive. And it's unclear whether Homer was a single man, or many men, or maybe even a woman. At the time, there were these entertainers called hetairai, who were very well versed in singing and dancing, recitation of poetry. So it's possible even that it was a woman. We don't really know. But the legend has it that it was a single man. And the legend has it that he was blind. And legend has it that he performed these epic interludes, these episodes, to the courts of Ionia on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. So for all intrinsic purposes, we go with the idea that it's one person. It's too complicated otherwise to talk about it as a committee. My suspicion is that it probably was, at one point, drawn together by a single poet who composed all this material based upon smaller performances that would have been kind of standard stuff, but that he drew it together and eventually got written down and organized into the number of books, the 24 books that we have now, and the verses and all that. And that's the issue that we have now. That's the piece that we have now, is this compiled epic poem that was originally a performance piece. And by performance piece, I mean that it seems as though it was all memorized and sung. That's kind of daunting, especially daunting for many students of this literature, for meeting it for the first time. To hear that one guy would have memorized this, all of this, is quite stunning. But consider this. If it were sung, and if it were performed in smaller sections, it's not utterly outside of the pale of understanding that a single person could memorize all this stuff. Think about our modern performers even. Modern performers in rock and roll music or folk music, they memorize a great deal of material, and they would have performed that material so often that it would be like second nature for them. So it's not utterly impossible that a single man would have memorized these books, if you will, these sections, that he would have then recited. I don't think he would have recited them alone, though. He would have sung them, it seems, because that not only is the tradition, but it makes more sense that he would have sung them. Tradition says that he would have sung them accompanied by a lyre. That is a stringed instrument, a U-shaped instrument with a gut strings, or now we say nylon, but gut strings on it, that he would have played while he sang. Now, there was a discovery of a Sumerian lyre that was done back, I think, in the early 2000s. You can look it up on YouTube. I'll make a link here. But this lyre was more like a harp, if you can imagine a performance concert-sized harp. That's probably more like what he played. Maybe the handheld lyre, smaller, but more likely this large instrument that he used in order to sing this song. There's a very good series of videos made using this reconstruction of this Sumerian harp done by a guy named Peter Pringle. I will, again, I'll link to this, but he has done a number of different instruments and a great deal of research on how these would have been used. Now, I suspect further that Homer, whoever that was, probably also did not perform alone. He probably had a rhythm section, drums and the like. If you've ever listened to a Middle Eastern performance of Middle Eastern music, I think it might have been something like that, using the dumbak and the dobra and the something like the tabla from Eastern India, maybe. Large drums, handheld drums, things like that. It probably was the case that he had backup singers as well, people that would chant sections alongside him or provide background noise, sort of an undercurrent of drone to his overarching singing, the line, much like what we hear in medieval music, much later, of course. But medieval music had the drone of the tonic and the dominant, often sung, just held while a single voice would sing the line throughout. My suspicion is that's probably what it was like to hear this performance. You would have a proscenium behind him, like I have the wall behind me, and you would have this great performer. Imagine somebody like, I don't know, for my generation, Stephen Stills or Neil Young or somebody of that, stature, Peter Gabriel or somebody. And he'd come out and he would sing to the sound of this magnificent concert lyre with drums, perhaps flutes, and also backup singers. And he would sing these passages, possibly on request, possibly he would have some of them set out beforehand. But it would be like sing that passage of Achilles when he is confronted with the three men that have come to persuade him otherwise. Or sing that passage about Achilles' anger against Agamemnon. Things like that. And the performance will be quite beautiful. It's not austere. It's not hard to get at, as it is for us. And it's not this sparse way of performance that became popular only in the 18th and 19th century, where the Greek world is beginning to re-emerge in Western culture. And most scholars thought that it was a very sparse world and primitive. And so they performed or treated the work as though it were high and regal and primitive and unadorned. My suspicion is it probably was not that. It was probably much more entertaining. Homer was a musician, if you will, who was performing in the 9th century, roughly. That's at least when the work seems to have congealed into what we have now. And the 9th century, the 800s, was really the end of a long period in Greek culture that was referred to as the Dark Ages. Sometime between the 1200s and the 800s, there's a 400-year period of really awful, awful times to be alive. The sea peoples came down from the north, whoever they were, and they attacked all these civilized areas and burned them to the ground, it seems, in constant warfare, and people fled into the hills. And most of the centers of Mycenaean culture, at least, were lost at the time. And when culture began to reemerge, it emerged not apparently in the mainland, but in the Ionian coast, just south of where our story is set, south of the city of Troy. That lends a sort of flavor to the work because, of course, the audience, who is the intended audience? The intended audience would be those people who were almost next door to where this war is taking place. Troy is right on what's called the Hellespont. It's the entrance into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. And anybody who wanted to trade with the very, very rich eastern ports on the Black Sea would have to go through this narrow choke point there. And sometimes the waters were difficult and you had to actually lift your ship out of the water, move it. And you get teams of men to do that. Or you'd have to sail past a narrow place that was fortified and you had to pay a toll to those folks. And so you're paying a lot of tolls up the area to the Black Sea. The idea being that when you made trade with the Black Sea coast there on the east. You made so much gold, spices, silks, that you could easily afford that toll, to up the Hellespont area. So the city of Troy was the first of many different cities along that area that became fabulously wealthy, powerful and wealthy. And they had a lot of allies along the coast that would pay them tribute. So what we see in the Troy here in our epic is a city very much like what was emerging again in Ionia, a city that was wealthy based on trade and tolls made upon merchants. Such a juicy, wealthy city would have been a prime target for a bunch of bandits, of pirates, and frequently they were attacked by pirates, especially the piratical people from mainland Greece, what we now call the country of Greece. That loosely banded group of people, which was less civilized, more like a biker gang, would descend upon this city and would attack it, hopefully laying siege to it, until it fell. The fall of the city of Troy was not always a given, of course, because sometimes it held out, and the besiegers are always much worse off than the besieged. But it seems to have fallen at least a few times, archaeologically speaking, because there actually is a city on a hill called Hisarlik, and there are several layers of city underneath it there at Hisarlik. And that city, which is now commonly accepted as the site of ancient Troy, seems to have been attacked over and over again, destroyed or held out, and then rose to power after it fought off the besiegers. So in our story, we have barbarians, biker gangs, uncivilized brutes, attacking a very civilized people in the city of Troy. Well, what does that show us? That bit of history shows us that the people of Troy, on the one hand, are of a type. They are civilized, wealthy, pampered. They have so much wealth that they don't want to fight. They aren't used to fighting. And yet in some ways, they're more noble. They have more leisure. They have more wealth. They have more culture than the Achaeans do. They have more allies and a better network of allies. But the Achaeans have a rugged, feral strength and a desire to conquer, which in some ways is animalian. It's almost like a ferocious animal of some kind. And so what we see on the one hand with the Trojans is these almost like I don't know, panty waists, like weak, demoralized, and degenerate characters. Paris, for instance, he's a degenerate. He lures Helen away by his great wealth and the promise of great cities. But when it comes down to it, Paris he's not a likable character, and he's not a guy who knows what living really is. He's surrounded by leopard skins, as the work says, and lives in an apartment filled with scent. Or you take the scene where Dolon goes out and gets killed by Odysseus. And Dolon is one of only a few that finally agree to go out and reconnoiter for Hector. Hector calls for people to go out and reconnoiter. Nobody wants to. And finally Dolon does. He steps up, but only because he asks for something almost impossible. It's like he has no conception of what he's getting into. He asks for the chariot of Achilles. Well, how the hell are you going to get that, man? The only way you could do it is by killing that guy, Achilles. And Achilles, as we find out, is this man-slaughtering machine. So when Hector says, yeah, sure, I'll give it to you. It's like Hector says, you're not coming back from this alive anyway. So, I'll give it to you, sure. But it speaks to the character of the Trojans, what type of people they are. Luxurious, pampered, really without the fighting spirit that we see at all in the Achaeans. Achaeans, on the other hand, this loosely based group of people from the mainland Greece who really, they've swept down. I guess you could say they're the people that swept down from the north and destroyed the Mycenaean culture. So in a way, it's hearkening back to that group of people called the Sea Peoples that had so demolished Mediterranean culture back in the 1200s BC. That group of people, that biker gang, that rough bunch of teenagers and infighting brutes, how on earth are they ever going to become civilized? That's kind of the question of the work. How do you bring a bunch of brutes to a point where they actually have civilization and become ennobled, become human even, you could say? The author of the text, the poet, the composer, he's really kind of got that in the back of his head when he's contrasting Hector to Achilles. You know, Hector comes across as a very noble character who makes an awful mistake at one point, where he commits his army far too much and he believes in the gods, which we'll get to in a minute. On second thought, let's talk about it right now. There is a very serious critique of the gods in this work. Homer is making a critique which is quite surprising, because most of the time we think, oh, the gods were revered, and Homer sets the standard for how we revered gods in the ancient world. And people in the ancient world thought of the gods as these noble and honorable powers that be. But actually, it seems like the gods prior to Homer, certainly, and maybe even during his time, were more like terrifying forces of nature and of human nature and of the universe. And they were particularly horrible and terrifying to human beings who were pushed around by them to some degree. They were part of a larger scheme of the universe, which was already set down, called fate in Christian thought, the Latin word fata, where we and the gods are all part of a sort of pattern of the universe that we can't escape from. And the gods in that pattern are violent, and they are terrifying, and they will work their will against us, and we do our best to placate them with all kinds of sacrifices and prayers. But really, the image of the gods in the ancient world was one of slavery, of humanity being enslaved to the gods. Along comes Homer, and he changes that, I think, because he creates gods who are whimsical, who are funny, who are laughable, who are buffoonish, gods that are driven around by lust, or who are driven around by fear, or driven around by their own personal desires. They are tricky and manipulative and grotesque and laughable. They are weak. At one point they get stabbed. One of the gods gets stabbed, and he bawls and blubbers to his father. They fight with each other all the time. In these kind of comical scenes where goddesses are afraid of getting singed by Zeus. They lust after human beings, as we see even with Aphrodite coming down and having children with humans. And so we have all these different elements of the gods that are just like kind of despicable. The gods are not to be trusted. They are to be almost laughed at. And we see this almost, we see this most clearly, almost without a doubt, in the character of Hector, I think. Because over and over again, the poet Homer says, he talks about human beings who are doomed to die. And he talks about human death as horrible and awful. He doesn't glorify it. The deaths in the work, aside from Dolan, are normally these awful, pitiful, sad events. Like all of book 2, the naming of all these different people, he names them like almost like the list of the dead at Normandy Beach or something. This guy and this guy and this guy, and oh, he did this, and oh, he had this farm, and he's never going to come home to see his folks and his family. And there's a sense that human beings are in some ways more noble than the gods. And Hector, who is drawn as this man who loves his family and who loves honor and really wants to do what's right and wants to save his city when his city is doomed. There's no way that they're going to survive this biker gang that has surrounded their city. Hector is more noble than the gods. And the tragic irony, I think, is that he because of his nobility, he's a pious man, because piety is the mark of the noble man. He is pious, and so he trusts the gods. And throughout the rest of the work, we find the gods are not to be trusted. And so Hector makes a terrible mistake based upon the trusting in Zeus. I mean, Zeus is the chief god. You'd think you could trust the son of a biscuit. But Hector does, and he gets in very, very bad situation because of it. Hector, eventually, what happens to him is so awful that one can't help but feel tremendous pity for him, sorrow, misery. And you don't feel the same in any of the instances of the gods getting hurt or not getting their way. Gods are never humiliated. Gods can always escape from trouble. Gods always whisk away the ones they love from getting damaged, as Aphrodite does to Paris, to set him down in his room full of scent. And I can't help but think that Homer is saying this is part of the major theme of the work. Because if we are gods, if we think that we are gods, then nothing really matters to us. Nothing is important. Nothing is vital. Only when we recognize our own mortality, our own inevitable death and suffering, only when we recognize that everyone we love is going to die, only when we recognize the common suffering of humanity, do we begin to take those things seriously, those people seriously. Do we begin to value people and things? It's only when they're put in jeopardy that we begin to think, oh, this thing's going to go, and so I have to love it even more than I do now. As Shakespeare said, I must love that thing that I must leave ere long. But if you're a God, you don't have to do that. As long as you stay a God, you don't have anything put in jeopardy, and so you don't have to love anything at all. Gods are eternal. They last forever. They will still be doing what they were doing before, and they'll still be doing in much later generations what they are doing in this epic story. And somebody said, if you love anything, you're going to suffer. And the only way to avoid suffering is to just not love at all. And that's godliness. You're godly. You float above the ether. You never have to worry about anything. You transcend it all. You're just out there on the moon somewhere, sitting and biding your time, like a Dr. Manhattan or something. And I often think that gods don't ever really die, too. And I think Homer, we say, oh, he's back in the 800s and they were pagans and they believed in gods. Yeah, true. But I think gods exist even today. What do I mean by that? Well, for one thing, when they have the 10 commandments of the God, Yahweh says, you shall have no other gods before me. And so Yahweh himself is recognizing that there are other gods, but don't put any before me. What does that mean? Well, do we still have people that think the only thing in life is to make money? That's a god. Do we still have people that think the most important thing in life is sexuality? That's a god or goddess. Do we have people that get consumed by warfare and cannot come back from the violence of warfare? That's a god. Do we have people that are driven by the accumulation of more power and more power and more power? That's a god, right? So people are still driven around by various ideas or tendencies or manias, menin, and those things that drive them around, call them what you will, are gods, right? How do we combat those gods? Well, I think that the epic poet here is suggesting that one way we combat them is by growing up, and that leads to our main theme of the work. Hector comes across as a very noble character who makes an awful, awful mistake at one point, where he commits his army far too much and he believes in the gods. But he's noble, he's virtuous, civilized, human, and loving of his family. And Achilles has no real family, no real attachments, no real culture, no real civilization. He's inhuman in his sense of the death of his comrades. And he himself is like a petulant child. He is like a juvenile. He doesn't want to grow up, and he gets mad at Agamemnon when Agamemnon takes away his play toy. So you get in Achilles this barbaric youth who has to change or become a barbaric adult. That question there is, is it possible to change a barbaric youth into a civilized human being, an adult? What would it take? What is it that prompts a young man especially to actually take account of his own propensity for violence and his own desire to destroy everything around him? Well, this was an ancient theme. I mean, this kind of theme was a theme of growth that goes way back, even probably to Neolithic times. That is before the 1200s even. The idea of how do you bring young people to become human, to become fully human. And it's a term which the Greeks called a metamorphosis. They looked at it primarily as embodied in the character of the natural world, the character of the butterfly. And the butterfly starts off as an egg and then becomes the grub, the worm, the dragon form, I guess you could say. And then it becomes the cocoon, the chrysalis. And then after the chrysalis, it emerges from the chrysalis as a full-fledged butterfly. It's an interesting metaphor they would use, that formation towards adulthood, because the chrysalis is armor around the worm. Okay? That's what it means, is golden, chrysis, shining. And you notice at the beginning of this work, Chrysis, the priest, has a daughter, Chryseis, or is it Chryseis has Chrysis? I forget. But the word chrysis in Greek means shining. So it's connected to that image of chrysalis, the armoredness. And you hear Hector, the shining helmet, right? And the armor of Achilles, as we'll see later, plays a major, major role. That armoredness comes up again and again, like fire or sunlight, surrounding the person while they change into the butterfly. Now, it's an interesting fact that the worm in the chrysalis gets completely pulverized. There's nothing that remains recognizable of the worm. It's just a goo inside of the chrysalis. And then it reforms and it becomes a butterfly. And the ancient world said that's what happens to humans. You are a child, you go into your teenage years and you become like a goo. And then you eventually emerge as an adult. How many of us looking back on our teenage years remember it as a sort of amorphous goo, right? That was me. I had no idea where I was going or what I was doing or what I was supposed to do, and kind of just driven around from one thing or another. So anyway, the whole theme of the work seems to be about change and alteration. How do you change a man like Achilles, man slaughtering Achilles? So he's no longer a petulant child, but eventually grows up to become a human being. Now, of course, there are other themes as well. We'll touch on those in just a minute, but there are other themes as well. But this seems to be the kernel of the whole epic. And the main thing that we see is the idea of rage in Achilles, because the author seems to say that's the earmark of youth, is rage. Menon is the word. Menon aera thea peleadeo akaleos. Menon is like our word mania or maniac. And menon is a type of rage that overcomes a person, so you don't even think straight anymore. We use the metaphor see red. And when we are overcome by menon, we want to destroy everything around us, just wipe it out. Just we rage and rage and rage. And the author seems to be suggesting that this is the major thing that separates men from children, from teenagers. Teenagers rage against things. Men or adults control that rage and use it as best they can. I guess you could use the term, it's like the dragon inside a person. But For this author, he's suggesting that that manin is not just anger, random anger. It's anger at something. You've got to ask the question, well, what's the anger about? Why are teenagers so angry? What are they mad about? What drives them to be so angry that they lash out at everyone? One could say it, to some degree, it's at the injustice of the world. One could say it's against the pain of the world. One could say it's at the loss that we all experience or become aware of when we're teenagers. Fall out of Eden, right? And things are no longer hunky-dory. And suddenly we realize we're going to die. Everyone's going to die. The world's going to die. And that injustice seems horrible. And the God or the gods seem horrible. And maybe that's where the real source of anger in this comes from. This author seems to suggest that our anger is really an anger at the very fact of being alive in an unjust world. We are not gods, and we will suffer death, and everything around us will suffer death. And that's a horrible, horrible thing to try and get our minds around. And one response, one immediate response we have towards it is rage, to be angry at everything, including the God and ourselves. That's the central problem that he brings up at the beginning. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that sent so many souls down to the house of death. If it's rage that we experience against the injustice of the world, the only thing we can expect is to send other souls down to the house of death, to make others suffer, and to ourselves eventually to go down to the house of death too. One last thing is that in all this, I wanted just to give a quick thank you to the people that helped me along the way with this sort of work. My father, first off, Roland Lassiter, who introduced me to this work for the first time. Dr. Ledbetter, who taught me in Greek originally. And then my mentor, Bill Walker, who also taught me about how to interpret literature and how to think about literature, especially epic literature. My colleagues, and also my students. Many of you out there who may be watching this or listening, you may not know it, but the 1 to 4 years that we spent together talking about this work and others changed who I am as a thinker and as a reader. And you made possible this reading as well. I wanted to thank Robert Fagels for his excellent translation, and anybody else who has helped contribute, including artwork, the artists who have done the sculpture and the various other artwork throughout history, and the composers who have inspired me, like Peter Pringle, for instance, and everybody else who has helped to contribute to this reading. Thank you.